Hi everyone. So last weekend, Natalie Grillon from Project Just joined me for a live Q&A, and it was such a pleasure to talk to her. Project Just is a wonderful ethical fashion resource, and she's just such an open, interesting, and inspiring person. We had so much to talk about. You can watch the full video. I will link it in the cards. It's just under an hour, or this is an edited down version. So let's jump right in. Welcome to the live Q&A with Natalie Grillon. Natalie, would you like to tell us just a little bit about yourself and where you're from?
So I'm the CEO of Project Just. I'm based here in New York City. And we started the company with an idea of like telling the stories behind our clothes about 3 years ago. And now we have our online platform where you can search a brand. You get to see the story behind the clothes, the policies that the brand has around ethics, sustainability. And then a little bit over a week ago, we launched Just Approved. Represents the best brands in fashion for their ethics, sustainability, their style, and their quality. And we're excited to spread that across the industry.
I was really excited when I found your website because I think it's so challenging to get more information about brands. I think it's so amazing that you guys pull all of that together into one location. And can you talk a bit about just like how that works? Do you guys have a big
Yeah.
research team or?
We are solving a very distinct set of needs for the shopper, which is basically like, I'm someone who wants to shop in alignment with my values. Where do I go to do that? And how do I discern which brands are taking steps to make their supply chain ethical and sustainable and which brands aren't? We take all this information from the brand, from third-party information, whether it be an NGO or an auditing organization, or even journal and media sites. We distill all of that into the key facts that we think are most important. And then we put up a brand profile for each of the brands. Every brand is researched by multiple people, and we fact check each of the items as much as possible. And then, of course, we invite comments as well. So we invite the brand to participate and leave their comments. We invite readers and users to comment. Our hope is that this continues to be a living, breathing platform and living, breathing project, and that we get even more crowdsourced information.
And so, how did you get started in this? Like, I know everyone kind of has maybe a wake up moment of realizing that things need to change in the fashion industry. And what was that for you?
I've always been really passionate about service and international development. My entire career has been in international development, mainly working in West and East Africa. I was placed in a position working in Uganda for a cotton company, working with farmers to help them sell their organic and fair trade cotton. For me, like coming from a place where ultimately what you do every day, you wake up every day as you're hoping to really change people's lives in a sustainable way. I saw this incredible model where the farmers' lives were really changing. They had, sustainable income. They were growing organic. So the soil was being preserved in a way that allowed them not to have to move from that land. Like it was just so many components coming together. Around that same time, I started talking to my co-founder about this idea of like, well, could we do a better job of telling the farmers' stories so that there was more demand for their cotton? I just felt that if their story was connected to the shopper, that they would want to buy more of this cotton. A couple weeks later, after we first had this idea, the Rana Plaza factory collapsed. And I had this moment of clarity where I realized that I didn't know if the farmer's cotton was ending up in a factory like that, just the way that the supply chain was organized. And I felt that that was such a disservice to all the hard work that they had done. I also realized as a development professional and someone who had committed my life to this work, I looked down at my own shirt and realized I didn't know if it had been made in a factory like that. And so my co-founder and I realized it's not just the good stories that need to be told better. It's also, we need more transparency about the bad stories too, so that the supply chain can be more accountable and we as shoppers can have more power with our purchases.
You run into just a lot of things where there just isn't any information available?
Several of the brands, there's very, very little information available. So if you look at Abercrombie and Fitch or Forever 21's brand pages, you'll see that we've had a very difficult time actually finding any information about their supply chain practices. At a baseline, most brands publish a environmental policy or a worker policy. And some of these brands don't even make that available. We think that that's a signal to the shopper that if the information isn't even available on the site, like they're not even making it publicly available, odds are this isn't a priority for them. Some of the brands, they haven't updated their sustainability report since 2012. If a shopper is looking to purchase clothing that aligns with their values, at a minimum, they should look for a degree of transparency from the brands around their practices and around their priorities. They may not be perfect. Most of the big brands aren't. No one is perfect, right? Even Patagonia, the gold star, right, isn't perfect. But you at least want to see intent. That's what we hope to promote, is to show when you see Forever 21 or you see Abercrombie and Fitch with no information, you as a shopper, I hope are saying to yourself, well, maybe that's not the best brand to shop at because I have no idea what's going on.
And what for you are some of the other really major issues in the fashion industry that need to be addressed?
So I think that waste, the amount of clothing that we're consuming is creating enormous amounts of waste. Clothing has moved from being a durable product, one that you would have in your closet and you would repair and you would keep for many, many years. It's become disposable, but there isn't textile recycling really set up in a way to handle that kind of volume of disposable good. So I think that textile recycling really needs to evolve. There's obviously donation programs right now, but in a lot of cases, what happens is the clothing is dumped in countries where they already have manufacturing industries, and then the dumped clothing is causing those industries to collapse. You also just have a lot of clothing donations that do end up in the trash as well, because the volume of clothing that we're donating, there's just not enough demand for that. So I think textile recycling is really interesting. A company called Evernew is one example where they're basically breaking down the textiles and creating new textiles from them. Levi's just did a pair of entirely recycled jeans. So that's really exciting to me. I think another major issue is just, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, because I struggle with this. I think we need to change the way we shop on a massive scale, but I also know what an enormous challenge that is. And so I'm kind of pulled in two directions. Right now, the amount that H&M produces on a daily basis, the amount that Zara produces on a daily basis, it's unbelievable. And I think we need to move towards more of a philosophy of like capsule collections and having this like real value and appreciation for the clothing that you buy. You know, there are bigger issues there. Some people just don't have the money to afford clothing that will last. So I think it's a much bigger issue, but I hope that there is a certain set of the population who does have the means to change their practices, moving clothing back to a durable good.
Yeah, I think kind of slow fashion as a concept is really the direction that things need to be going, owning less but better pieces. For me, with fast fashion, just having to break that mindset of being able to just go into a store and pick up something that I never even really thought about wanting, but I just saw it and decided to buy it. Determining if it's something that you actually need and are actually going to use, that step alone really slows down the shopping process and allows you to just not get those impulse purchases, which I think a lot of people have in their closet, right? These clothes that they bought but haven't actually worn.
So there's this idea of like happiness you get from a new item of clothing that I think a lot of people would appreciate. Like I myself, if I purchased a new item and it comes in the mail, I do get a little dose of excitement. I think that that's like this inherent behavior that is very difficult for us to try, for like those of us who work in this space to combat. And so I'm excited about these kind of ideas that are not necessarily just telling people like, oh, it's bad, like you shouldn't buy from these brands, and you should spend more money. I think that those are hard things for the shopper to swallow. So if you're able to have like a couple different things going on where it's convenient for them to sort of shift their habits, I think that we can really move in the right direction. One thing is like just approved, right? Is being in a retailer and seeing that just approved symbol on a pair of jeans where you know like, oh, well, this differentiates between the brands that maybe I don't know anything about and then a brand that has really been vetted. And that helps answer that like information question. I'm excited about some of these direct to consumer models. Or some of the like leasing models. Mud Jeans has a really cool model where you can lease a pair of jeans. And then like the sharing economy as well, like some of the stuff popping up where you can lease like a bag for a couple weeks, rent the runway. These kinds of models I think are really going to like help tackle this idea of like immediate accessibility and constant turnover of your wardrobe. Like you can have the trends and you can be in style and you can have that sort of happiness factor, but in a more sustainable way.
Yeah, I was actually really excited to find out where I'm living, a clothing library opened up where you pay a monthly fee and
Yeah.
you can take out up to 4 items of clothing. It's exciting to see people come up with new creative solutions.
I very much believe in the ethical fashion movement. I believe that we really have to like get to know the stories behind our clothes. I believe we need to see more value inherent in our clothing. But we're up against this behemoth of fast fashion that so many consumers are now attuned to. Thinking about changing everyone towards this model of slow fashion is a long way down the road. Like if you look at the food industry, not everyone buys organic, not everyone buys fair trade. And McDonald's is still, even though they're not doing as well, they're still there. So if you compare that to fashion, I think that the models where it's easily facilitating small shifts in behavior, as opposed to telling people, no, you have to like completely change the way you shop, I think that that can have an enormous positive impact, even if it's just these small little steps. So like a clothing library, exactly. That's the kind of thing that I really think has so much potential.
Sarah in the chat brought up a really good point, and she talks about struggling with investing in good pieces of clothing when her size is changing a lot. And I'm curious about your thoughts on that, because I think that's something a lot of people struggle with.
One thing that I tend to do a lot with my girlfriends, we do a lot of like sharing and borrowing of clothes. Even my girlfriends who are, maybe going through a phase in their life where they're pregnant or, other life shifts, right? It's great to have a set of friends and establish this idea of like, okay, well, once a year we do clothing swaps. Then you get to see a wider variety of sizes and a wider variety of items, and you can borrow it for the year. And I know here in the States that there are more and more clothing swaps happening on a larger scale too, not just among friends. I also think like vintage shopping and thrift store shopping is a great way on a budget to find stuff of different sizes, to add that flexibility. It's completely sustainable.
So in the chat, Fiona says, for me, availability is the biggest problem. Many online shops don't ship to my country or it's very expensive. Do you have any tips?
Accessibility and affordability. At the end of the day, it's like there's a barrier to me purchasing from these new ethical brands. So I think that one thing I really encourage people to do is go to the thrift stores and go to consignment stores. Like there is actually a lot of cool stuff there. I don't know about in other countries, but right now the 90s are like coming back in here, and it's like slip dresses, right? And even the like people are wearing the chokers again. That stuff is all there. And there's no need to like buy a new. My first thing would be like, go shop vintage, go shop consignment and see what you can find there. Because in a lot of cases, you'll be surprised. You do have to do a little bit digging. It's a little bit of a treasure hunt, but it's super fun, I think. And I found that like in most of the countries I've traveled to, a secondhand clothing market is always available. You just have to find it. I mean, email the brands. If there's a brand you really love, like I know Everlane is a brand that a lot of people keep an eye on. They do a good job of sort of marketing where their clothes are made, although we found that there's not a lot of information necessarily beyond that. They actually did international shipping for a couple weeks. If you keep an eye out and you email the brand and say, hey, like, do you have upcoming sales where you're going to do international? Just ask them. And in some cases, they'll make exceptions and help you out.
And I think too, it's always good to bring up things with brands because you never know, like they might have a lot of people asking that same question. And
if you
Right.
let them know that that's something you're interested in, then they might make those changes.
They may be selling in a boutique. They may have a wholesale relationship in your country, but they don't ship internationally. And you just might not know that that store carries their stuff. So try that too.
What would your, I guess, first piece of advice be to someone who's brand new to shopping ethically and just starting to think about where their clothes are coming from?
The first thing I always tell people to do is watch True Cost. It's a documentary by a filmmaker named Andrew Morgan. Number one, it's incredibly powerful. But number two, I think it does a very good job of educating you on each of the main issues, from the cotton production to the factories, to the waste, to worker wages. It just really introduces you to a lot of stuff. And then also our consumption habits. So you see by the end of the movie, I mean, everyone I know that's seen it is really moved to the point that it's like, I just need to stop shopping for a little while until I know where my clothing is coming from. Watch that movie and then take a break for like a month. Don't buy anything new. Look in your closet, see what you have, really become reintroduced to your closet and look at it with a new light. And then once you've really gotten through that, the third thing I say is then get yourself over and understand what the vintage and consignment world is like. I mean, again, I don't mean to be harping on this, but I really do think that given the amount of clothing that we have started consuming, there's a lot of really great clothes ready to be reused. The last thing I say is I really encourage people to use our platform, look at the practices that the brands have, their sustainable and ethical practices. So you become familiar with which brands really do have positive intent and are more transparent about their practices.
And how do you balance all of those different aspects on Just? Because I notice you guys don't do like a rating system or anything like that.
We made a very concerted effort and decision not to basically say this brand is better than this brand. When we looked at Abercrombie and Fitch versus Forever 21 versus Uniqlo versus Kate Spade versus Kowtow, all the People Tree, right? So many different things that go into production and into decisions about how to make an item of clothing that it's very difficult to assess a Patagonia versus a People Tree. Patagonia is using like these different kinds of very advanced technology fabrics versus People Tree's using a lot of organic cotton. People Trees decided to emphasize fair trade, whereas Patagonia is doing fair trade, but they're doing it through a different system. There's so much nuance and context into how our clothing is made that we felt like it was a disservice to the shopper to assign a number that was actually like in a lot of ways kind of meaningless. And so instead, we just said, let's just get people to know what's going on, give them an overview and sort of assess it based on like a pros and cons stance. And then from there, what we'll do is we will recognize and sort of award those who are really like pushing the industry forward, who are really making strides to improve things, not just for their own brand and supply chain, but also for the industry as a whole. And that's where the idea of Just Approved came, which is trying to be that stand-in for what you're describing, where it's like, well, I've read all this stuff about all these brands, but I don't really know which are the best ones.
I love the system that you use because I think we all have different priorities. Someone might really heavily value vegan materials. Someone else might really care about fair trade. Someone else organic. So I think it's almost nice to just have that information available and then people can find the brands that best fit with what they're looking for. I'm really curious, what's in your closet and what are your, I guess, favorite brands?
It's right there. I actually do have like a lot of vintage stuff. I've always sort of been someone who loved having items that had stories behind them. My grandfather was an international pilot. So my grandmother and my mom as well and her sisters all have these like incredible, sort of collections with stuff from all over the world. And I think that gave me an appreciation and a desire to have similar pieces. And I've also been fortunate to get to work and live in a lot of different countries. So some of my favorite pieces, I took like a what's called a bubu, which is a West African men's garment. It's like a big giant shirt that goes all the way down to the floor. It has beautiful embroidery right here. And I had a tailor there in West Africa sort of cut it and make it into more of a women's dress. And then I also have some tailored pants from Uganda made from African fabric that I really love. I have a lot of pieces actually that I've gotten from vintage stores here in New York. There's a great place called Housing Works. But then from ethical brands, I have some pieces. I do have some pieces from Everlane. I have a piece from Kowtow. I have a piece from Zadie. And then I have a few pieces I've also purchased from Modavanti. Modavanti has a variety of different brands on their site. Like you were saying, you know, I sort of have priorities around, I really like for the brand to know where the clothing comes from and that they're paying their workers correctly. And then I also like to see in most cases that it's either organic or it's some sort of a sustainable material. I really prefer that because I know what conventional cotton production looks like. And in a lot of cases, it's really destructive to the environment and uses a lot of water.
So Charlotte brought up a really good point. She says, I was amazed by how many highly educated friends still don't believe that the circumstances and environmental damage is really that bad, but believe that after Rana Plaza, this doesn't happen anymore. And that's something that I really struggle with, is talking to other people, talking to friends, and just people you meet about these issues. Because I think it's really important not to like attack anyone else for what they're doing, but to have some sort of positive conversation around it. Do you also agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I actually, like, my roommate just came home the other day having shopped at Forever 21, and I was like, kind of like blown away because she knows what I do. But it, you know, it's sort of offered me the chance to have a conversation. One thing that I really find is a great trigger is to talk about quality. No one likes to feel like I'm buying something and it's not what I paid for. And so when you start the conversation around, well, I really noticed that like Gap, or I've really noticed that like Primark, or, you know, insert brand here that people shop pretty regularly, really notice that their quality has gone downhill. And that, I think, has like, it resonates with a lot of people because it's something that everyone has noticed. And so if you go down that route of being like, I think some of the reasons for that are, number one, because they're trying to produce as much fashion as they can. And then number two, because they're not taking the time to make quality clothing. And number three, as a result, they're not paying people well. You can start to introduce these other issues where it's coming from a perspective of like, no, you have a right to buy clothing that matches your values and that has quality. The definition of quality then for your friends expands from whether it's just falling apart to like the people and the supply chain that made it. I think that to me is the best way to go about it. Now, I also know that a lot of people say, well, I can't afford ethical fashion, right? I just can't afford it. I hear that and I recognize it. And I think that like there are some people who just can't. It's too expensive. But that's where as we were talking about before, these other models of like, well, try vintages and consignment. It's not any worse than anything else, right? It's actually better. It's actually better quality in a lot of cases than what's being sold at H&M. Or, you know, insert fast fashion brand here. And number two, like try to introduce this conversation of like, well, is it worth it to you to buy a $10 t-shirt that's only going to last you a year? Or is it worth it to you to buy a $40 t-shirt that's going to last you the rest of your life? I think it is a very difficult conversation, but I really think quality is the hinging factor that you can engage on.
And Selma says, I want to start shopping at secondhand shops, but I always feel that people who don't understand my reasoning, they'll think I'm disgusting. Any tips for overcoming this fear of shopping secondhand?
So what I think is cool is that you're starting to see vintage all over Instagram. A lot of bloggers are incorporating vintage into their looks. And so the more and more that happens, I think the more that this idea of secondhand being like not as good will start to fade. My closet is full of vintage stuff. And every time, and I'm not trying to like toot my own horn, but every time that I wear one of those pieces, I always get compliments. Like, where did you get that? That's so unique. Part of what you have to do is become comfortable with your own identity and how you dress and think and get creative about mixing and matching pieces and owning it, basically, and like owning your own individual style. And then vintage can become this really beautiful exploration of, well, how can I mix and match pieces I already have with something new I found? Don't necessarily go to a thrift store first. They can be like a little bit overwhelming with the amount of stuff that's there. What I would recommend is go to a vintage store or a consignment store and just go through. And sometimes the stuff in there can be a little bit expensive, but walk through, go to the clearance section. Yeah, like search vintage on Instagram, just the hashtag, and see what comes up. I just think like, I totally get where you're coming from, but grab a friend and just go on a search and see what you find. And I think you might be surprised. Okay.
I think they actually offer a really great conversation starter too. Like I know that if someone says, hey, I really love that skirt, I can say, oh, like I got it secondhand, or it's this vintage piece. And it offers a really wonderful opportunity to have a conversation around shopping secondhand and why you do that and, you know, the benefits of it.
You become an evangelist, like you become an educator and a teacher. And there's always cool stories. You start to gather pieces from your travels or even from like different spots around your city and the different neighborhoods you go to, you're going to find really cool stuff. The other thing I would just add is nobody's perfect, right? I think that there's this unrealistic expectation that you need to completely 100% change your habits. Buy some stuff vintage, buy some stuff from ethical brands. And if you need to go into Zara once in a while to get like a dress, like, yeah, it's about a step-by-step process. It's not about like, oh, tomorrow I'm going to completely change my closet, right? This is a journey. And so I think give yourself that flexibility to say, if I have a wedding I'm going to go to, I'm going to look at Rent the Runway. I'm going to look at like the local vintage store. I'm going to look at what I have in my closet, see what's available. I'm going to look at what my friends have for me to borrow. And you have all these options available to you before you say, well, I'm going to go like try a gazillion dresses on, you know, at every store and still feel frustrated. I think it's thinking about this like positive opportunity to have a plethora of options available to you rather than sort of thinking about it like every time I buy something, it's so bad, right? It's about the little impacts that you make every day, the small changes you make every day, and the accumulation of all of those across us, like each of us, and then across all of us that are doing it.
So Asta says, something I've come up against is friends questioning that it makes a difference to the garment factory workers for us to cut back on our consumption. Any thoughts on this? And I've had a bunch of questions like this too, where people are basically saying, well, you know, if we don't support these big brands, then do people lose their jobs?
So H&M is not going anywhere anytime soon, right? If we cut the volume at which we are purchasing from H&M, it's going to be a little dent. But at a minimum, at least if we as a group of shoppers are caring more about it and not shopping there as much, the hope is that it starts to spread throughout the industry, that you pay those workers more and you pay them for fewer hours. Bangladesh and India and Vietnam, there are highly skilled workers there who have the capacity to make beautiful clothing. But right now, the distinction that I would make is that they're getting paid nothing, basically nothing, and that their hours are terrible, and they're working under conditions that are really terrible. If you say, I don't shop at H&M because I don't agree with their practices, and there's more and more people saying that, then H&M is incentivized not to necessarily like completely cut jobs, because they're not going to go out of business, right? But they're incentivized to say like, these clothes were made by people who were paid fair wages and who didn't work ridiculous hours, right? Whether that be through fair trade or some other sort of symbol, maybe through Just Approved. Then the conversation becomes not like, oh, well, H&M is going out of business and those workers aren't going to have any work. No. It's more about this brand is making sure that their supply chain practices are better than they previously were. You can talk about reducing volume, but raising the price a little bit more on the items, or just like cutting into some of the profits that these big companies are making. I mean, they are making enormous amounts of money. You can pay your worker a little bit more. And I really get frustrated when people say, like, oh, well, they're not going to have jobs anymore, and that the workers are going to be mad if they don't have jobs. Like, some of these people aren't even allowed to leave the factory when they want to. I mean, it's essentially modern day slavery. We have to start like having a conversation based on reality, saying like, oh, well, all their jobs are going to be eliminated. That's theoretical. Let's talk very practically about each of these supply chains and what can happen to make sure that like we keep jobs, but people are paid a living wage.
I would love to know what motivates you and inspires you to keep advocating for ethical fashion. Because I know it can get really overwhelming and disheartening at times when you hear about all of the pretty awful things that are going on in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, most recently, I just got so sad and frustrated when I heard that there were Syrian refugee children working in some of these factories in Turkey, the factories that were producing for H&M. And I just, it's like days like that where you're like, God, like, what are we even trying to go up against? But there's a couple things that keep me going. So number one, it's when we get letters or little notes on our social media or anything where somebody's like, thank you so much. This is a resource that I've been looking for and it's helping to change my practices. Just like, that's exactly what, if we can keep doing that and building on the number of people who are, having that happen, then that really is the change. The second thing is when I think back, and I need to go back soon, but the farmers I was working with in Uganda, those people are working so hard and they're putting their hearts and souls into growing organic and fair trade cotton. And it's more difficult than conventional cotton. It is, but they love that it's a sustainable part of their economy, that they don't have to use expensive chemicals to grow the cotton, and they can get a little bit more money for their hard work. That to me is, as I said before, a model of long-term sustainability that can spread everywhere. When I know and I think about that there are models out there that work, and I've seen it also in like India with some of the artisan co-ops, and I've seen it at some of these bigger factories where they are having unions and they are paying living wages, right? I know it exists. So when I think about those workers or those farmers, and I know that they are out there fulfilled and living a purposeful and like happy and a life where they're treated fairly and just, that to me is what keeps me going, because I know that we can do it. I know that we can start to shift this industry and change the status quo.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much for joining me on this channel, and thank you to everyone in the chat and for watching. This was really awesome. So yeah. I really appreciate it. And if you guys haven't checked out Project Just, there should be a link below. Definitely check it out. It's really a wonderful resource, and I'm so happy that you guys are doing that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention, please sign up for our newsletter. We send out some, not only like updates on the brands, but we also have a lot of like fun content we do around shopping ethically and sustainably, like what shopping vintage means, what donation means, so that it's like a complete package. And then the other thing is we're launching a crowdfunding campaign on June 22nd on Indiegogo. So please sign up for our newsletter so that you can participate in that. We love doing this service for the community, but we need more resources to be able to do more research on the brands.
Yeah, because I don't think we mentioned, but you guys are a nonprofit.
Yeah, so if you use our platform and you're willing to contribute a little bit, that's enormous. Like, we really appreciate it, so we can add more brands and do more just approved guides.
So definitely, and I'll be sharing that on my social media and stuff when that comes out, so that you guys have links to that. Well, then,
right.
Thank you again.
So I hope you enjoyed this video. A huge thank you to Natalie and to those of you who joined us in the chat. I will include some links to extra information and some of the things we talked about below, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you're not yet subscribed, you can hit that subscribe button up there, and I will see you in the next one.